Edward Harper was a man of science, a man of reason, and a man who believed that every mental affliction had a rational explanation. His reputation as a top psychiatrist in the city was built on his ability to dissect the human mind, peeling back the layers of delusion, paranoia, and anxiety to expose the raw truth beneath. But as he sat in his office that overcast Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the case notes of his latest patient, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his gut like a lead weight. The patient, Daniel Moore, was a man in his late 30s with no previous history of mental illness. A successful architect, Daniel had come to Dr. Harper claiming that his shadow was trying to kill him. At first, Harper had dismissed it as a form of schizophrenia or severe anxiety disorder. But the more he read, the more he began to question the simplicity of his initial diagnosis. Daniel had described in vivid detail how his shadow seemed to move independently of him, how it had grown darker, more solid, and how, on more than one occasion, he had caught it smiling at him. A wicked, knowing grin that sent icy tendrils of fear snaking through his veins. Harper had heard of pareidolia before, the mind's tendency to see patterns where there were none. But there was something about the way Daniel described his experiences that made Harper's skin crawl. The first session had been unsettling, to say the least. Daniel had sat in the chair opposite Harper, his eyes sunken and haunted, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "It's not just a shadow," Daniel had insisted. It's something else. It waits for me when I sleep, when I'm not paying attention. It knows things about me, things I've never told anyone." Harper had nodded, making notes as Daniel spoke, but the cold dread in his stomach had continued to grow. There was an intensity in Daniel's voice, a raw fear that was contagious. Harper found himself checking the shadows in his own office more than once, shaking off the irrational notion that they were moving closer. He had prescribed Daniel a course of antipsychotics and scheduled him for weekly therapy sessions. Rationality, he reminded himself, was the key to treatment. But as the weeks passed, something changed. Daniel's condition did not improve. If anything, it worsened. He arrived at their sessions more disheveled, more paranoid, and the stories he told grew darker, more terrifying. He spoke of how his shadow had started appearing in places it shouldn't, on the walls of rooms where no light source should cast it, on the ceiling above his bed as he lay sleepless, staring up at it, waiting for it to move. "It's watching me, Dr. Harper," Daniel had whispered one session, his voice trembling. "It's waiting for the right moment. I don't know what it's going to do, but I know it wants me dead. I see it in the way it smiles." Harper had tried to reassure him, to convince him that shadows were merely the absence of light, that they couldn't hurt him. But deep down, Harper was starting to feel the strain of Daniel's delusions. Every time Daniel described the shadow's grin, Harper could almost see it in his mind. Dark, twisted, and malicious. Then one evening, as Harper sat alone in his office reviewing the latest notes, he felt it, a presence. The room had grown cold, the lights dimmer, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, his own shadow, stretching out across the floor, darker than it should have been, more solid. He froze, staring at it, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it moving? Was it smiling? Harper shook his head, rubbed his eyes, and laughed at himself. It's just stress, he told himself. You've been working too hard. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. The next day, Harper called Daniel in for an unscheduled session. He needed to get to the bottom of this, needed to understand what was happening to his patient and to himself. Daniel arrived looking worse than ever. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept in days. "Dr. Harper," Daniel began, as soon as he sat down, "it's getting worse. It's not just following me anymore. It's becoming me." "What do you mean?" Harper asked, leaning forward in his chair, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's hard to explain," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't just see it in the corners of my eyes anymore. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I don't see myself. I see it. It's like it's trying to take my place. I'm losing myself, Dr. Harper. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Harper felt a chill run down his spine. "Daniel, have you been taking your medication?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Daniel shook his head. "It doesn't help. Nothing helps. I feel like I'm being erased." Harper wanted to tell him it was all in his head, that there was a logical explanation for everything he was experiencing. But the words caught in his throat. He couldn't ignore what had happened in his office the night before. Couldn't dismiss the growing sense of dread that was clawing at his mind. "I think we need to explore this further," Harper said finally. "I want to try something different, hypnosis. It might help us get to the root of this, help us understand what's really going on." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try anything at this point." That evening, Harper set up the session in his office. He dimmed the lights, arranged a comfortable chair for Daniel, and prepared himself for what was to come. As Daniel lay back, eyes closed, Harper began the induction, speaking in a calm, soothing voice, guiding Daniel into a deep, relaxed state. "Tell me about the first time you noticed something strange about your shadow," Harper said once Daniel was fully under. "It was a few months ago," Daniel murmured, his voice distant, detached. "I was working late on a project. I stood up to stretch and I saw it. But it wasn't where it should have been. It was on the wall across the room staring at me." "What did it look like?" Harper asked, his pulse quickening. "It looked like me, but, different. Darker. It smiled at me like it knew something I didn't. I thought I was imagining it, but then it started to move on its own. How did that make you feel?" "Terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept happening. And then, one night, I saw it. I saw it grinning at me from the ceiling while I was in bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like it was feeding off my fear." Do you think it wants to harm you? Daniel's breath hitched. Yes. It wants to take me over. It wants to be me. Harper felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Daniel, I want you to visualize your shadow now. Can you see it? Yes, Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. Where is it? It's right behind me. Harper's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the room, but everything seemed normal. He knew it was irrational, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Can you turn around and face it? Harper asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Daniel whimpered. It's smiling. It's always smiling, Harper swallowed hard. I want you to confront it, Daniel. Tell it that it doesn't control you, that it's just a shadow. Daniel began to shake, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't. It's getting closer. Harper reached out, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You're safe here, Daniel. It can't hurt you. But even as he said the words, Harper felt a presence behind him, cold and malevolent. He could feel it creeping closer, a dark force that sent shivers down his spine. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was there, but he had to know. Slowly, Harper turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. There, on the wall behind him, was his own shadow. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was darker, more defined, and it was grinning. The same twisted, malevolent grin that Daniel had described. Harper's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It couldn't be real. Shadows didn't move on their own. They didn't smile. They didn't... But this one did. He felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to look away from the dark figure on the wall. The shadow's grin widened, and Harper could swear it was laughing at him, mocking him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Daniel, Harper whispered, his voice trembling. I think we need to stop this session. But Daniel didn't respond. He was still deep in the trance, his eyes closed, his body shaking with fear. Harper tried to calm himself, tried to think rationally. This had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light. He was under stress, his mind playing tricks on him. But the shadow didn't fade, didn't waver. It remained solid and terrifying, its grin growing ever wider. Desperately, Harper reached for the lamp on his desk, his hand trembling so badly he almost knocked it over. He needed to dispel the shadow, needed to banish it with light. But as he turned the lamp on, the shadow didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow darker, more solid, its grin splitting its face like a wound. Please, Harper whispered, his voice choked with terror. Please go away. But the shadow remained, watching him, grinning at him, feeding off his fear. In a panic, Harper grabbed Daniel by the shoulders, shaking him violently. Wake up, Daniel, wake up! Daniel's eyes snapped open, and he let out a blood-curdling scream as he saw the shadow looming over Harper. No! It's here! It's real! It's going to kill us both! Harper staggered back, his mind reeling. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. The shadow was all around him now, suffocating him, its grin twisting into something monstrous, something not of this world. In that moment, Harper understood the truth. This wasn't a delusion, wasn't a figment of their imaginations. The shadow was real, and it was hungry. Harper felt the cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around him, pulling him down, pulling him into the void. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadow, devoured by the darkness. And then everything went black. When Harper awoke, he was alone in his office. The lights were on, and the room was eerily quiet. He looked around, his heart pounding, but the shadow was gone. There was no sign of Daniel, no sign of the darkness that had consumed him. For a moment, Harper wondered if it had all been a dream, a nightmare born of stress and fear. But as he stood, he saw it, his shadow, stretching out across the floor, darker than it should have been, more solid. And it was smiling. Harper staggered back, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But as he turned to flee, the door slammed shut, the lights flickering, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. Harper was trapped. The shadow moved closer, its grin wide and terrifying. It was no longer content to follow him, to haunt his every step. It wanted more. It wanted him. As the darkness closed in, Harper realized with a sickening dread that there was no escape. The shadow had already won. It had always been there waiting, watching, biding its time. And now it was going to take him. The last thing Harper saw was the shadow's grin, wide and all-consuming, as it swallowed him whole. Dear travelers of the abyss, as we leave Dr. Harper's tale behind, a question lingers in the darkness. When you turn out the lights tonight, will your shadow be content to follow, or will it want something more? If this story has left you trembling in the dark, remember to like and subscribe. And in the comments below, share a word, just one, that sums up the fear gnawing at your mind right now. Until next time, when we once again descend into the abyss of horror.